She begged for a second chance. But I can't forgive the one thing she betrayed. The day started like any other, ordinary and unremarkable, until I saw her. She wasn't expecting me. I could tell by the faint flicker of surprise in her eyes, but neither was I prepared for the flood of memories that came rushing back. There she was, standing in the corner of the cafe, sunlight glinting off her hair, her posture effortlessly graceful, like she had always belonged in every space she entered. I felt my chest tighten, not from physical exertion, but from the sudden, unbidden weight of the past. She smiled, that warm, quiet smile I remembered so well, the one that could make everything feel lighter and heavier at the same time. Time had touched her face gently. Faint lines at the corners of her eyes spoke of laughter and sorrow alike, and her presence carried the confidence of a woman who had lived, loved, and lost. She wore a soft scarf around her neck, the kind that hinted at comfort and familiarity, and I noticed, as I always had, the subtle fragrance that lingered in her wake. It was like a whisper of memory, pulling me closer even as my mind warned me to stay away. We greeted each other cautiously. Her voice had the same warmth, but also a certain hesitation, a carefulness that betrayed nerves she was trying to mask. "It's been a long time," she said, and I nodded, forcing my expression to remain neutral. "Long time. Yes, but not long enough to forget." The memories of betrayal, of late nights spent questioning everything, were still there, threaded through the back of my mind like thin, fraying rope. As she handed me a cup of coffee, our fingers brushed, briefly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to send a shiver through me. I caught myself holding the contact in my memory, remembering how her touch had once felt like home, how it had once made the world seem like a safe place. I deliberately pulled my hand back, as though distance could protect me from the pull of her presence. But even as I did, my heart betrayed me, skipping a beat in spite of my caution. We exchanged small talk, tentative and polite, but every word carried weight. A glance lingered too long, a laugh was slightly softer than usual, a pause in conversation spoke volumes about things left unsaid. I was aware of the subtle tension in the air, the invisible lines connecting us, pulled taut by memory, desire, and regret. She tilted her head slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face, a gesture I had memorized years ago, and I found myself caught between wanting to reach out and needing to step back. In that moment, I realized the cafe wasn't just a place to meet. It was a stage for an unspoken duel of hearts. We were both testing boundaries, measuring trust and risk in the briefest of movements. I wanted to believe she had changed, that she had learned, that we could try again. But deep down, I wasn't sure the heart could forget betrayal so easily. And yet, as she smiled again, shy and tentative, I felt the first spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope mingled with fear, and the fragile possibility that our story wasn't entirely over. We found ourselves walking along the quiet streets after leaving the cafe, the afternoon sun casting long, soft shadows on the pavement. The conversation was casual at first, deliberately light, talk of work, mutual acquaintances, and the little details of life that seemed safe. Yet beneath the surface, every word carried a subtle weight, a hidden rhythm of emotion neither of us wanted to fully acknowledge. Every glance between us was loaded with meaning, every pause a reminder of the space we had once shared, then lost. I noticed how she moved, still so composed, so aware of herself, but there was a slight hesitation in the way she stepped, a vulnerability she didn't fully hide. She laughed at a joke I barely remembered making years ago, and for a moment her eyes met mine and lingered. That look, soft, searching, made my chest tighten. It was familiar, like a song I hadn't heard in years but could still hum perfectly. I wanted to reach for her hand, to close the invisible gap that had opened between us, but caution anchored me. There was history here, and history had teeth. Her hand brushed against mine. Not fully, just a passing touch as she adjusted the strap of her bag. The warmth of her skin against mine was electrifying, but fleeting, almost cruel in its brevity. I pulled my hand back, aware of the rapid beat of my own heart, the way a small, innocent gesture could ignite an avalanche of memories. There was so much left unsaid, and yet we both spoke volumes in silence. At a small park bench, we stopped to rest. Sitting side by side, the gap between us felt both enormous and impossibly small. She shifted slightly closer, just enough that I could feel the heat of her presence, the subtle brush of her sleeve against my arm. I caught myself leaning in without realizing it, drawn by the magnetic pull of familiarity. I could smell the faint trace of her perfume again, a delicate mix of jasmine and something warmer, more grounding, and it brought back late nights, whispered secrets, and laughter that had once felt endless. Every gesture was a test. I observed her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the bench, the slight tilt of her head as she studied a bird hopping nearby, the way her voice softened when she laughed at her own joke. She didn't reach for me, and yet the air between us was thick with possibility. I wanted to ask about her life, her regrets, her longing. But even in the casualness of our words, I knew the real conversation had yet to come. There was a rhythm forming between us, a quiet push and pull. I wanted closeness, wanted to close the years of distance in a heartbeat, but I was painfully aware of the betrayal that had once divided us. Her glances were loaded with a silent question, a hope, and I felt the tug of desire mingled with hesitation. The sunlight warmed our faces, the world moved lazily around us, yet we existed in a bubble of suspended time, each heartbeat heavy with unspoken longing. By the time we parted that evening, the tension had grown thicker, unacknowledged yet undeniable. Every brush of fingers, every lingering glance, every careful pause had built an invisible bridge connecting us once again. But whether it would hold or crumble remained a question neither of us was ready to answer. One thing was clear. The past hadn't faded, and the present was charged with quiet possibility. The next meeting felt heavier, like walking into a room where memories hovered in every corner. We sat across from each other in a quiet corner of her apartment, the muted light from the window casting soft patterns across her face. I noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the way her lips trembled slightly as she searched for words. It had been years, but some things didn't fade. They waited, patient, until the moment they could no longer be ignored. She took a deep breath, and the familiar scent of her perfume reached me again. A comforting, almost painfully intimate reminder of what had been. I never meant for things to fall apart like they did, she said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of regret and vulnerability. She avoided my gaze for a moment, staring instead at her hands resting in her lap, fingers intertwined as if holding herself together. I wish I could take it back, all of it. Her words struck me, but not in the way she might have hoped. Pain, sharp and lingering, surged through me. Not anger, not exactly, but a hollow ache of trust broken. I remembered late nights spent alone, questioning every choice, every promise, every whispered, forever, that had once seemed unshakable. Her confession wasn't new. I had rehearsed it in my mind 1,000 times over the years. Yet hearing it now, from her lips, stirred something deeper. A mixture of longing, sadness, and a sense of finality that made my chest tighten. I studied her face, tracing the subtle changes that time had brought. The gentle lines at the corners of her eyes, the softness of her jaw, the quiet maturity she carried now. She looked older, yes, but also more fragile in a way she had never allowed herself to be with me before. And for a fleeting moment, I saw the woman I had once loved, the one whose warmth and laughter had made the world feel endless. But underneath it all, the betrayal lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. I know you're sorry, I said quietly, my voice low but steady. But sorry doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't undo the nights I spent wondering if I'd ever be enough, if I'd ever matter. I kept my hands folded on the table, resisting the urge to reach for her, to bridge the distance with something tangible. I wanted her close, but I also needed the space to remind myself that some wounds weren't easily healed. She looked up then, her eyes glistening, and for a moment the silence between us was louder than any words. The weight of history pressed down, thick and almost suffocating. Yet there was a strange intimacy in the honesty, in the shared recognition of what had been lost. She leaned forward slightly, just enough that I felt the warmth radiating from her. But she didn't close the gap. respected it, perhaps sensing that trust was not easily reclaimed. In that quiet, fragile space, I realized the truth. We could talk, we could linger, we could remember. But some things, once broken, leave an imprint that time alone cannot erase. And yet, I couldn't deny the flicker of something lingering beneath the pain. A pull, subtle but undeniable, that reminded me why I had loved her in the first place. For now, though, it was enough to simply sit across from her, to breathe in her presence, and to acknowledge the past without pretending it didn't hurt. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope over a void of memories and unspoken feelings. She suggested meeting again, casually, almost nervously, and I found myself agreeing. Not because I trusted that things could be the same, but because the pull of her presence was impossible to ignore. Each encounter became a delicate dance, a test neither of us wanted to fail, but one that required constant vigilance. We met at a quiet bookstore, the kind with worn wooden shelves and soft jazz playing in the background. She wandered between the aisles, her fingers grazing the spines of books with careful attention, and I followed, keeping a respectful distance yet feeling every subtle shift of her body like a magnetic pull. She picked up a worn copy of a novel we had both read years ago and smiled, a small, tentative gesture. I could see the warmth in her eyes, and for a moment, it felt like old times. But there was a tension there, a shadow lurking beneath the surface. When she handed me the book, our fingers brushed. It was brief, almost accidental, but the warmth lingered far longer than it should have. I wanted to hold her hand, to let that connection speak the words we weren't saying aloud, but I resisted. The betrayal of the past hung between us like an invisible barrier, and I wasn't willing to cross it lightly. Her eyes met mine then, searching, questioning, and I realized this was her test as much as mine. She wanted to see if I still cared, if the past could be softened by presence alone. We found a quiet corner to sit, and she leaned slightly closer to whisper something about the book. The closeness made my heart race. I could feel the subtle heat of her shoulder against mine, the delicate rhythm of her breath brushing past me. It was intoxicating, and yet, every instinct screamed caution. I could see in her eyes that she longed for forgiveness, for closeness, but she also knew how fragile this moment was, how easily it could break if I reached too far or too soon. The conversation drifted from books to memories, small confessions slipping out as if the walls between us were thinning. She laughed softly at something I said, and the sound wrapped around me, familiar and aching. Her hand rested near mine on the bench, a mere inch away, but it was enough to ignite old feelings I thought I had buried. I wanted to reach, to close the space, but I held back, letting the tension simmer, letting her know without words that I wasn't yet ready to fully trust again. Every smile, every brush of her fingers, every lingering glance became a test of control, of patience, of whether love could survive betrayal. I realized then that trust isn't something given lightly. It's measured in moments, in small gestures, in the willingness to hold space for someone who once hurt you. And while the desire to forgive and reconnect pulsed through me like a quiet undercurrent, the memory of being broken before was still sharper, more insistent. By the time we parted that evening, the air between us was charged, thick with unspoken questions. We had tested boundaries without breaking them, drawn close without touching too far. And though nothing had been resolved, I knew one thing for certain. Trust, once fractured, demands more than words. It demands patience, restraint, and the courage to confront the heart's deepest truths. The evening air was heavy with anticipation, thick with unspoken words and memories too long buried. We met at a quiet park, the city lights casting a soft glow across the empty benches. There was a hesitation in her step, a subtle tension in the way she held herself, and I mirrored it without realizing. We were both aware that tonight wasn't just another casual meeting. It was a reckoning, a confrontation with the past that neither of us could avoid any longer. She spoke first, her voice low and tentative. "I know I can't ask you to forget," she said, her eyes searching mine, shimmering with an honesty that made my chest ache. "But I want to try again, if you'll let me." The words hung in the air, fragile yet loaded, as though their weight alone could tip the balance between hope and heartbreak. I felt the old familiar pull, the part of me that still remembered the warmth of her hands, the comfort of her presence, the quiet intimacy that had once defined us. But it was entangled with anger, disappointment, and the raw ache of betrayal. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Trying again isn't that simple," I said, each word deliberate, measured. "You broke something between us. Not just trust, but the sense that what we had was unshakable." She flinched slightly, her shoulders tightening, and I noticed the subtle tremor in her hands. Her vulnerability was real, palpable, yet it wasn't enough to erase the past. She stepped closer, cautiously, and for a heartbeat I considered closing the gap, letting history dissolve into the present. But I remembered the nights I had spent alone, questioning everything, wondering if love was enough to survive betrayal. I couldn't pretend it was. Her eyes softened, and she whispered, "I never meant to hurt you. I thought we could find a way, but I failed." The tremor in her voice pulled at something deep inside me, a mixture of longing, sorrow, and the faintest spark of hope. I studied her face, the way the streetlight caught the subtle lines of her expressions, the glint in her eyes that spoke of regret and unspoken desire. It was a woman I had loved, a woman I still cared for, but the pain lingered between us like a ghost. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension roll off my shoulders. "I know," I said finally, "and maybe I still care, more than I should. But caring doesn't fix what was broken. It doesn't make it okay." My hand stayed in my lap, still, refusing to reach for her, refusing to cross that invisible line. She nodded, accepting the truth without argument, a quiet acknowledgement that some things could not be undone. For a long moment we just stood there, close yet apart, sharing the same space while keeping the necessary distance. The city hummed around us, indifferent to our pain, and yet in that silence, there was a strange intimacy. We had confronted the heart of our past, faced the betrayal, and acknowledged the raw, unhealed parts of ourselves. It hurt, but it was real, and in that reality, there was a seed of understanding, even if it wouldn't grow into reconciliation. As we parted that night, the weight of our words lingered. The confrontation had ended, but its echo remained in the quiet ache of my chest, in the way her eyes searched mine one last time. We had reached the peak of emotional tension, and though the path ahead remained uncertain, I knew one thing. Honesty, even painful honesty, had changed us both forever. After that night, the city felt different, as if every street and corner carried a memory of her presence. I walked alone, letting the cool evening air brush against my face, each breath heavy with thought. The confrontation had left an imprint, a mix of pain, longing, and clarity that I couldn't easily shake. Her words, her apology, her regret, they echoed in my mind, intertwining with the lingering warmth of her hand against mine, the softness of her smile, and the subtle intensity of her gaze. I found myself replaying every detail of our meeting, the way she had leaned forward slightly, the careful tremor in her voice, the unspoken tension that pulsed between us. Each memory was a reminder of what I had lost and what I still desired. And yet, beneath that longing was a sharp, undeniable truth. Some wounds leave a mark too deep for time or desire to erase. Trust, once broken, is fragile, and even the most genuine remorse cannot restore it instantly. I sat in my small apartment, staring out the window at the city lights, and felt the weight of choice pressing down on me. Could I allow myself to open that space in my heart again, knowing the pain that might follow? Could I risk hope for the possibility of reconciliation, or was it wiser to step back, to preserve the self I had rebuilt in her absence? The questions spun through me, relentless and consuming, as if the quiet night itself was holding its breath, waiting for my answer. Her presence lingered like a soft ache. I remembered the brush of her fingers, the warmth she radiated, the subtle glances that had once ignited a flame between us. Part of me wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance with a hand, a word, a gesture, but restraint anchored me. I had learned that desire alone cannot repair a fractured past, that love without trust is fragile and fleeting. My heart recognized the pull, but my mind insisted on caution. In that solitude, clarity began to form. Not a resolution filled with passion or romance, but a steady, quiet understanding. I could acknowledge the bond we shared, the moments that had shaped us, without surrendering to the temptation of erasing the hurt. Some things, I realized, are meant to teach us, to remind us of boundaries, of the delicate balance between vulnerability and self-preservation. I thought of her one last time before the night ended, the faint curve of her smile, the subtle way she had searched my eyes, hoping for forgiveness. I felt a mixture of warmth and sorrow, knowing that our paths were entwined by memory but not by future promise. I understood that love and care could exist without reconciliation, that connection does not always demand union. By the time morning arrived, the decision had crystallized. I would honor the bond we shared, the lessons it had taught, and the tenderness that still lingered, but I would not allow the past to pull me back into pain. Our story, I realized, would exist in the quiet spaces between memory and acceptance, in the gentle recognition of what had been, rather than what could never be fully restored. The final meeting wasn't dramatic. There were no words of grand declarations, no sweeping gestures of reconciliation, just a quiet, deliberate acknowledgement of everything we had shared and lost. We met in the same small cafe where our uneasy reconnection had begun, the familiar scent of coffee and old books grounding us in a reality neither of us could escape. She arrived first, as always composed, but I noticed a subtle softness in her expression, a quiet acceptance of what was to come. When I walked in, she looked up, and for a moment, time slowed. Our eyes met, lingering in that familiar way, and I felt the familiar pull, the warmth of her presence, the faint echo of laughter, the subtle ache of longing. But unlike before, there was no hesitation. We both knew the boundaries now, the limits that had been carved by betrayal and preserved by understanding. We exchanged a tentative smile, the kind that carries years of unspoken memory. She reached out briefly, brushing her fingers against mine as she handed me a cup of coffee. The touch was fleeting, but it spoke volumes. Care, acknowledgement, affection without expectation. My chest tightened, but I held my composure, letting the moment exist without trying to claim it, without trying to rewrite history. "I've missed this," she said softly, her voice carrying that same warmth that had once made the world feel lighter. There was an honesty in her tone, a quiet vulnerability that no apology could erase, yet it wasn't enough to undo the past. I nodded, acknowledging her words without overcommitting my own feelings. "I've missed it too," I admitted, allowing a sliver of truth to pass between us. We spent a little while talking, our conversation lighter now, tinged with the gentle humor of old inside jokes and shared memories. There were no confessions, no promises, only the acknowledgement of a bond that had once shaped our lives. Occasionally, our hands brushed against each other, intentional yet restrained, a reminder that intimacy can exist without romance, that care can be expressed in the simplest of gestures. When it was time to leave, we stood together outside the cafe. The evening air was cool, carrying a faint scent of rain. She reached up and lightly touched my shoulder, a gesture that felt like both a farewell and a benediction. I responded with a brief, gentle hug, careful and measured, letting her feel the warmth of connection without overstepping the invisible line we had drawn. As she walked away, I watched her retreating figure, the sway of her hair, the quiet grace in her steps. My heart ached in a way that was both familiar and distant, a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for what could never be repaired, gratitude for what had been shared, for the love that had shaped me even in its imperfection. I turned and walked away in the opposite direction, carrying with me a sense of closure I had not expected. Our story would remain in the quiet corners of memory, a bond that changed us both forever, even if it did not lead to reunion. There was no bitterness, no regret beyond what had already been felt, only the lingering warmth of a connection that had endured time, betrayal, and distance, leaving its mark on both of us in the most profound way. In that resolution, I realized the truth. Love is not always about holding on. Sometimes, it is about letting go while honoring what once was. And in that letting go, there was a strange, quiet peace, a gentle acceptance that some bonds, though not rekindled, remain unforgettable. Teen.